the big data course. Just a couple of minutes to start. We're just giving, a one to the
We've got some strange audio sounds there, Andrea. I don't think that's you. There we go. Yes, thank you. I think Sanjay just went on to mute. Thank you for that.
Yes. So thank you everyone for joining today to the second day of the course. Before we start, I just would like to remind you to put your microphones muted. If you have any questions or any comments, please you can write your questions or comments in the chat space, or also you can raise your hands as well. Joe will start delivering the course today, and it's the same dynamics that yesterday, right, Joe, with your presentation and also some pieces and a recap.
Yes. That's right. Yes, so we'll have a brief recap on just the topics from yesterday. We have 2 new sections today, and we'll have a couple of little quizzes in at the end of each section. So that's the lay of the next 2 hours.
Okay, thank you very much. And Joe, the floor is yours.
Actually, Andrea, while you're still here, there is just a question from Tosif about the course material being not available on the web portal. Would you just be able to let everybody know how they'll be able to access the material after the course?
We will share it by email.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. So at some point in the next day or two after this course, everybody will receive the slides over email. Great. Okay. Hope that answers the question there. Wonderful. Thanks, Andrea. So shall I go from here? Wonderful. Perfect. Lovely. Well, thank you, everybody, and welcome back to our second day. Now, just before we start, to let you know, there is a little bit of background noise here. There's some work that's overrunning, but we have done what we can to mitigate any of the sound. So hopefully you can't hear it, but if you can, hopefully you'll be able to hear me clearly over the top of that. But apologies if you do hear any kind of small noises in the background. I'm hoping that it will soon finish if you can hear it a little bit. Okay, so let's start then. And as I say, welcome back to day 2 of this course on mobile big data and AI. So to very briefly recap, yesterday we covered sections 1 and 2. So section 1 was about understanding what big data is, what AI is, and then looking a little bit more deeply into mobile big data analytics and sustainable impact and the kind of benefit that it could have. And then we moved on to section 2, where we had the great video that we got the audio working for in the end, and we had the various examples of how mobile big data can be applied to address challenges, answer questions, help with preparedness in the context of social good, and in line with many of the SDGs. And as we mentioned as well, this is really only the tip of the iceberg, and the potential applications of this mobile big data analytics are very broad. And so having an understanding of how it works and how it can be used can help to enlighten future projects. So today we're going to be looking at sections 3 and sections 4. So section 3 is around the foundations of mobile big data and analytics. So we're going to be diving in a little bit more to how that raw data is processed. And we had a few questions yesterday that were kind of starting to get into this area. We'll also look at how we can apply AI techniques So that's really about how to deal with the data. And then for the second part of section 3, we'll look a little bit more at the stakeholders. So when we're running a project for mobile big data and analytics and AI, who needs to be involved in order for us to deliver a successful project? And then finally, we need to look at the sustainable business models and how we can ensure that these projects are sustainable. And then for the second part of the session today, we'll be moving to section 4, which is about the principles. And this is 2 key areas that we'll be covering. The first is around policy and regulation considerations, and the second is around ethical AI. And then we'll conclude with the course summary. And as I've mentioned already, we'll have a couple of quizzes as we go through the session as well. So if I move to the next slide, just to recap. So now we're going to be looking at foundation. So how do we manage the data? How is it processed? Who are the stakeholders involved? And what are sustainable business models when it comes to these sort of projects? So let me move to the first slide. Okay, so this diagram here provides an overview of the way that raw data is processed and turned into something useful. So it shows the complexity of the work that is needed. And I think one of our participants yesterday mentioned how complex it does look. And but what we're going to do today is break it down into more digestible parts so we can understand it more closely. So broadly, we've got 3 key stages to this, and I'm going to just point my cursor over here so you can see. So first of all, we have this here is all the raw data that's coming in. So we have data like customer data, event data, and network data that we talked about yesterday, coming from the operator. So the first stage is processing, and this is where we're turning the data into usable, clean data. The next stage is the analytics stage, that's stage 2. And then finally, we've got the products and services. So this is really the output and the insights, and the insights in the usable form for the decision makers that are going to make the decision. And as you can see also, it's worth mentioning at the bottom that when we're in the analytics process, we can also include, and very often do include, data from third parties. So if you remember yesterday, we talked about things like weather forecasting and weather sensors to check what the current weather is, sensors looking at ground moisture, lots of potential. We also talked about the TV records from India. So any potential source of data that comes from somebody that isn't the operator is classed as third-party data in this process. Okay, so what we're going to do now is look at each of these steps in turn. Actually, before we do that, we are going to have a brief recap of where the data comes from. So I've just mentioned now, but we talked about it yesterday. We have got 3 main sources of raw mobile big data from the mobile network operators. This is the customer data, so socio-demographic information, the information when they sign up, the activity and their status in terms of whether they're an active or inactive customer. The next is event data, so information about the calls, SMS, if you remember those lots and lots of lines of data that we got in the call detail record. When cell handover, so when we're moving from one cell tower to the next cell tower, and other signalling updates that we have available on the network. And then finally, the network data, so the geographical locations of the cells that were attached to, any information around infrastructure, and also the infrastructure status as well. So is it currently unavailable for some reason? So that's a recap on the data. And then the next thing we want to pick up on before we go into the details of the data processing is the importance of privacy. And we did start to touch on this yesterday. So once the raw data has been obtained, it needs to be processed, as we've said. But one of the reasons for this is as we've talked about yesterday, is mobile big data is quite noisy, and it needs a significant amount of work by experts to produce these accurate and reliable results. And we need to perform quality assurance and validation, and we also need to correct and control any source of bias that we know that we have in the data. And as we mentioned yesterday, the experience to do this lies within the operators where the data is generated, and thus they can best understand where there's noise and bias that can be ironed out. We have just a question in here. Okay, Andrea, I think we have there's a question from Carlston. Perhaps you could answer that over the email while we continue. I think it's an administrative question, so I'll carry on. So as we talked about yesterday, we have this data that needs to be processed, and we need to iron out the bias and the noise, and the mobile network operators in a good position to understand this because they understand the data, and then they can address that. However, one of the other key activities during the processing stage is to anonymise or to pseudonymise the data, and this is really important to maintain an individual's privacy. So diving into the privacy element a little bit more, the GSMA has a really strong belief that's backed by many research studies that respect for people's personal privacy is one of the best ways that we can maintain trust in a connected world. And in a survey that was done in 2014, the GSMA found that 83% of mobile internet users are concerned about sharing their personal information when accessing the internet or using applications from a mobile device. So mobile network operators take privacy protection very seriously, precisely because it's very important to their customers. But when it's done properly, there's absolutely nothing for users to worry about in the analysis of mobile big data, because it should never be about tracking individuals. It's about identifying broad patterns of behaviour that give useful insight to the problem at hand. So if you remember yesterday, we talked about broad population movements or broad population densities, never about individuals' movements. So we do look a little bit more at that in the later section when we're looking at things like policy and ethics. But important at every stage, so we do like to mention it. And I did also mention a couple of terms there. I mentioned pseudonymized data, so it's probably a good time now as well to just examine what the key privacy terms mean. So personal data is any information relating to an identified or an identifiable natural person. So that's personal data. But we also have the term pseudonymized data, and this is data that can only be associated with an individual through the application of additional information. So pseudonymized data is generally considered to be personal data, and pseudonymization is a safeguard to protect privacy. So let me give an example. If we had, if all of us on this call today, we have our first name, which is our personal data, and if we had a course list of everybody that was joining the course with all of the first names, that is personal data. However, what we could potentially do is replace our names with a number, and that would pseudonymize us. So it would only be pseudonymized because it could potentially be possible for us to later match up our numbers with our names. So because it's possible to associate us with that identifier, that means that data is pseudonymized rather than anonymized. That's the difference. So then if we talk about anonymized data is data that cannot be associated with an individual at all. So it means that it's not possible to be able to use another set of data in order to uncover who that person might be. So it removes the ability to link the data with an identified or an identifiable natural person against any reasonable efforts, actually, and that there is a reasonability test that we need to take into account, such as time and technical means, to be able to ultimately go back to identify who that person is. They're the terms: personal data, pseudonymized data, anonymized data. It's also worth mentioning that detailed location data is very difficult to truly anonymize, because movement patterns of people are highly individual. If you think about everybody, if you're based in an office, for example, and if you think about all of the people who work in the office with you, if you think about all of their various routes to work, probably it would be easy to identify many people from understanding just what route they took to work. But you'll be able to identify who they are, because movement patterns are highly individual. So this means that a series of locations relating to a single customer is likely to be unique. So it is possible to re-identify those people. However, we do have steps in the processing of the data that allows us to protect customer privacy while processing this big data and sharing insight, and we'll cover that a little later. But just that's something to be aware of: personal data, pseudonymized data, and anonymized data, and ensuring that steps are taken to anonymize that data. Okay. Right then. Let me go to this next section, which is just a small aside, really, and it's probably worth mentioning the topic of contact tracing and mobile data analytics. Contact tracing, I think, for a long time was something that was only really familiar to epidemiologists. So it's a really long-standing tool for epidemiologists to investigate and reduce infection rates in a targeted way. And however, since the arrival of COVID-19, the concept of contact tracing has become a little bit more familiar. So the idea about contact tracing is when a person has been identified as tested positive for a particular infectious disease, contact tracing is a process of going back to identify which people they've been in contact with, because they may be at risk of being exposed to the disease, so they may have also contacted the disease. And historically, this was done, manually by telephone calls. You'd ask the person, who have you been in contact with, and then the investigator would contact them, and they'd be tested, and so on and so forth. Oh, if you could just go on mute, please. I think we've got an echo. Oh. Right, I went on mute. I'll try that again. Yeah, brilliant. That's gone. Fantastic. Okay, so actually, sorry, I just really changed that. I will put my chat back so I can see the questions. Great. Historically, contact tracing was, and in some cases, of course, still is done manually. However, during the COVID-19 epidemic, I'm sure that you're aware that a number of mobile applications were developed that could perform contact tracing type functions. So when these were developed, basically in these devices, they were using an application that used proximity to just measure when a mobile device had been close to another mobile device that had got the same application on. And then when a person tested positive for COVID-19, they could declare that they tested positive, and that would alert all of the other devices that had been with the application that had been in close contact that somebody with a device that had been close to them had got COVID-19, so it could alert them to test themselves or quarantine or whatever the rules were at the time in the particular country. However, it's really important to clarify that this kind of process is totally unrelated to mobile big data analytics in terms of what we're talking about today. These proximity applications, the data is not something that's made available to the mobile network operators, and it is not data that they can use for mobile network analytics. And however, it would be easy to see how potentially you think it is a similar thing. So we just use this slide to explain how it's different. When we're talking about mobile data analytics, we are very specifically talking about non-identifiable and aggregated data and insights from groups of people. So as we've mentioned before, we'd be looking at all those core detail records to see where people have been attached to a particular geographic location, but that's anonymized. So the taking away any reference to personal data, and aggregated, which is a tool to again ensure the privacy, because individual movements are highly identifiable, and mobile data analytics uses that data. So hopefully that wasn't too a long-winded explanation of the difference between digital contact tracing and mobile data analytics, but hopefully it's clear and it is understood that they're different topics. So, okay, let's go to where I said we were going to go, which is around the data processing, excuse me. Okay, so in fact, I'm going to whiz back because it's taken a few minutes to get there. So I'm just going to remind everybody about this slide here. If you remember right at the very beginning. So we talked about the data that was coming in, then the three stages, so the processing, the analytics, and the products and services. So this is what we're going to focus on now, these three stages of going from the raw data through to the insights. So let me jump back ahead to where we were. Great. Okay. So first of all, let's look at the first stage, which is the data processing. So taking the raw data and turning it into something usable. So there are generally 8 stages involved in processing location data, including any data with geographical component. And these are the first 4. So the first one is filtering. And filtering refers to the removal of any irrelevant records from the data generated from the network. So it requires detailed knowledge and detailed knowledge of the customer base as well as behaviours within a specific market. And we did have one of our attendees yesterday. Apologies, I've forgotten who it was, who asked the question about IoT data. So IoT data would be a classic example here where we would filter out any IoT data before we did any further work. The next is enrichment. So enrichment is the addition of other sources to the data to add structure to it, making it more informative. So this can include geospatial data, describing the locations of the network infrastructure, operational data on infrastructure status and systems logs and that kind of thing. So putting in the geographic coordinates of the cell towers, for example, would be enriching that data. Okay, the third step is regularization. I always struggle with that one. There's a couple of words I struggle with. And regularization is the process of mapping events to a unified framework in a space and time. So, this can be quite a complex concept. So hopefully I'll explain it well. But for example, we might, a cell tower might be grouped into a 1 kilometre grid, and the times might be rounded to the nearest hour, or it might be more appropriate to look at administrative regions such as boroughs, states and counties, and events that happen on a weekly or a daily basis. I think the best way for me to explain this actually is if we go back to what we were talking about yesterday when we were talking about the different types of insights that we were generating. When we were looking at the Airtel India case, where we were wanting to understand people's daily commute patterns in order to understand if there were areas of the country that were susceptible to TB. We wanted to understand population movements over a fairly small location over just one day. So what we were looking at was where people were based in the morning, and then which cell tower people were attached to in the morning, and then where they were attached to in the middle of the day. So I see, when I say morning, I probably should say middle of the night, like 2 a.m, because at 2 a.m, somebody's likely to be at home in bed. And at 2 p.m, they're more likely to be at their office or at their place of work. So if we have a temporal measurement that looks on maybe an hourly basis, that would be able to help us look at short-term pattern movements. And also geographically, we were interested in people moving from one catchment area for a clinic to another catchment area. So the geography was quite small. However, if we compare that to the last of the examples that we looked at, which was looking at longer term migrations as a result of climate change, actually we were more interested in understanding what people's average geographical locations were over a much longer period of time. So maybe over 1 month or 6 months or even over a year, and possibly over wider geographical regions, moving from one state to another state, for example, or even one country to another country. And in order to be able to answer those questions, the data needs to be regularized before we use it to ensure that it has the right spatial and temporal categorization for us. Okay, so that's regularization. And then the final one of the first 8 is location assignment. So this involves selecting an algorithm to determine the actual location of a subscriber over time. I think I've already really covered on this. So based on the location events in that time period, so different algorithms will give different results. So it's vital to be able to select the most appropriate solution for the question that you're trying to answer. So I think we've merged those two together. So understanding, for example, another example would be when we were looking at the Telefonica São Paulo example, looking at commute periods across the city, we're actually probably wanting to understand locations every 10 minutes in order to allow that to be a proxy for car travel rather than over a week or a month or a year. Okay, so the next 3 in terms of the processing are normalization. So normalization is a comparison against a historical baseline to understand the significance of certain patterns. So for example, knowing that there are 500,000 people in the City of London is less informative than knowing that on the weekends there are 10% fewer people in the city on the average than on the weekend, than on the average weekday. And those are the kind of patterns that are already established in the mobile network, and the specialist will be able to understand and apply when looking for new patterns. The next one is validation. So this is vital to ensure that the processed data reflects reality as accurately as possible. So operators weed out that bias and the inaccuracy in the data by checking their outputs against a set of consenting users, against historical norms, and by using network monitoring to ensure that all of the outputs include relevant data. So I think, again, we touched on that yesterday about how can we ensure that, for example, it's representative, gender representative, for example. So this is the validation process that we talked about. Then the segmentation. So this is when the data is separated along demographic lines, such as gender, age or income. This is also known as disaggregation, which is a term you might be more familiar with. And but what is possible here very much depends on the customer data that's been collected. So it could be a legal mandate, or it could be through business operations. So depending on how the data is collected and what data is collected, you need to have an understanding of that before you make a decision on how you're going to use it. And then the final in the processing is around aggregation. So this is the process of collecting together individual trajectories. And as we've mentioned, these so individual routes to work, for example, are can be very privacy sensitive, even in their pseudonymized state, because there's a risk of knowing that in my office only one person lives at that side of town, so, or in that particular village, so their route to work is going to be very unique to them. So aggregation is about grouping together people so that in their patterns of behaviour, so that it's not possible to be able to go back and re-identify them. And this is a really important precursor to the analytics, and it's a prerequisite before sharing any data at all outside of the organisation. Okay, so I think I have a question from Jenny. In the stage of validation, is demographic void often a problem? Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it's something that certainly needs to be addressed. Yes, as we mentioned yesterday, in terms of if we're looking at often we're looking at demographics based on the information that we've been provided at the time that the person signs up for their account with the operator, and not always is the end user the person that signed up. So often in some countries, some regions will find that the male in the household will often sign the contracts, even though the end user is female. So we need to look at that. And also in some countries that information is or in some operators, I should say specifically, rather than it being country specific, the data isn't captured at all. So as we've mentioned here, in terms of validation, there are a couple of different ways that the operators can address that. One of them is to check outputs against a set of consenting users. So, for example, a network operator may have done some surveys to understand the gender split of their base on average, with consenting, as in they have asked their users to fill in a questionnaire and collect that information that way. So there are tools like that to enable them to measure it. I probably couldn't give I can't give a number for what percentage of these are a problem, but suffice to say, being aware of it is the critical element, so that when the raw data is being processed, that validation is addressed, and the operators and the data scientists feel confident and can provide a level of confidence that the data is representative of the population. So hopefully that answers the question. Great. Okay, fabulous. Thank you. Okay, so there we go. We're on our first quiz already. So this is great. I just remind myself on this one. Right. Okay. So raw data needs to be analysed to be turned into useful insights. And here we need to put the different stages of the process into the correct order. So actually, these probably should be A, B, C, and D, or we could do 1, 2, 3, 4. But let's go A, B, C, D. So what is the correct order? Please feel free to answer into the chat. Is it A, products and services, analytics and processing, or is it B, processing, products and service and analytics, or is it C, processing, analytics and products and services, or is it D, analytics, processing, products and services? So if you can remember back at the beginning of the slides today, and then we recapped on it, we had the diagram where on the left-hand side we had all of the data input, and then we had 3 processors. I think I might need to do a quick reminder here. So we've just been through the first phase now, which is about the processing of the data. So stage 1 is processing the data. Then stage 2, once that data has been processed, we analyse the data. Hey, we've got some coming in now. Yeah, thank you, Tarek, Bilay, and Carson, Krishna. Yeah, Noel, Neeraj. Fabulous. Yeah. So processing first, then analytics, and then the products and services. So what we've just covered now is the ins and outs of the processing part. And actually, just to kind of recap again on the question yesterday, the processing part is very involved. It's probably the most involved part, and as you can see from those 8 sections that we've just been through. Okay, so the next question, I don't know whether people have jumped ahead here, but what does pseudonymization refer to? Does it refer to data that cannot be associated with an individual? Is it information relating to an identifiable person, or is it data that can only be associated with an individual through the application of additional information? Yeah, I can see a few C's coming up. Brilliant. Yeah, thank you. That's absolutely right. Brilliant. So it's data that can be associated back with an individual person. Fabulous. Okay. Let's move on then. Oh, I beg your pardon. I've got another question for you here. I should have seen that. Okay, so the third question is, filtering and enrichment are 2 mobile data processing mechanisms that involve which of the below activities? So filtering and enrichment. So is it A, removing the irrelevant records and adding other important data sources? I can see Jenny straight in there. Mapping events and adding other important data sources. C, comparing irrelevant records and adding other important data sources. Or D, mapping events and comparing irrelevant records. Yeah, we've got mainly A's there. That's absolutely great. So filtering is about removing the irrelevant records, so filtering out the IoT data, for example, and then enrichment is adding that other important data, such as maybe the network geography data, the coordinates of the cell towers and that kind of thing. Fabulous. Okay, so that's the first of the 3 stages, the processing. And next we go to the analytics. So by this stage, we've got cleansed and processed data, and we're able to combine it with other sources to develop analysis that really fits the research question or the objectives that we're trying to achieve. So the specifics of this stage are heavily dependent on the project and the desired outcomes, but they'll almost certainly involve data from other non-mobile sources, as we've mentioned. So Here, very much in the first phase where we're talking about processing, the expertise very much sits with the mobile network operators here, because they understand the raw data, they understand the bias and the noise, and they're able to process it into a usable format. Now, this next stage around analytics, the expertise may sit within the operators, absolutely, but it also might sit with agencies or governments or other third parties, and it very much depends on the question that we're trying to answer. So if I move to the next slide. So here we're talking about the other data sources, and we did touch on these a little bit yesterday when we talked about the use cases. But other data sources can include, but again, not restricted to, map information about administrative boundaries, medical records, especially geolocated ones. So, for example, the number of TB cases by region that we saw yesterday. Infrastructure information such as roads, buildings and transport networks. Of course, that was useful for the disaster response planning that we saw in the last example. Places of interest such as planned evacuation centres and medical clinics. Weather data, especially with anything related to maybe pollution or climate change, and also satellite imagery is a helpful third-party type of data as well. So as you will have noticed, many of these data have a strong geographical component, and mapping data might include administrative boundaries, as we saw yesterday with the India TB example. And mobile big data outputs are often framed against these, so they can be aligned with official statistics. So if we think about, any administrative boundary or political administrative boundary often helps with official statistics, so they can be compared and contrasted. So infrastructure and land usage maps can often be really useful pointers for improving the accuracy of journey analysis and population mapping. And population maps can also be used to calibrate estimates of mobility as well. So in epidemiological applications, the locations of medical cases are really invaluable, and this can be used to map the spread of specific diseases or specific strains. And then when combined with the mobility data, it helps us to predict future outbreaks. And we saw examples of this yesterday with both the TB case and also the COVID-19 case. And then weather or data, climate data adds an important dimension for it. For example, when predicting vulnerability to climatic extremes or predicting air quality, as we saw in the Sao Paulo case. And satellite imagery, actually this can provide a real wealth of information to enrich other data sources. So image processing techniques can enable settlement detection, car counting, or even air quality and atmospheric measurements, which can be an additional third-party source. So all of this can be used to complement and calibrate the data that we get from the mobile network operators. So we've talked about the different types of third-party data that we could use with the processed mobile network data. So now let's have a look at the analytics techniques. We've got a list of first here. The important thing actually to talk about when we're talking about analytics is the process isn't necessarily linear, and it's normally iterative and requires, I'm going like this, but I'll use my mouse, hopefully you can see it. It usually requires a number of iterations through here, and but typically we use these 4 stages. So let me go through these first of all. So the first one is exploration. So this is where the data quality is assessed and the basic properties and trends are examined. So we need to look at what data do we have. So if we go back to the TB India case, we knew what mobile network data we had available to us in terms of population densities and population movements, but we also needed to explore what other data we'd got available to us in terms of TB reporting cases, the fact that the TB cases were reported by clinic, which covered a particular geographical catchment area. So understanding a little bit more about that, that's stage one, sort of exploring and working out what do we have here or what can we get hold of as well. The next stage is the modelling, and this is where we get all the data, take all the data that we have and develop a hypothesis from the data that we have available. So this isn't analysed at this time, but this is working at a hypothesis for what we hope the data can conclude for us. Then the next stage is prediction, and this is where the data and the algorithms are used to predict, the future. And then finally, there's testing, which is where the performance of the models are assessed, ideally against additional data. And so often you may find that at various stages, but often in testing, you might do some testing and then realise, this isn't quite giving us what we were expecting. So that might then take you back to tweak on the prediction, on the algorithm, or actually it might take you back to modelling, or actually it might take you right back to exploration, because you might think, we're missing a different type of data that ideally would like here. So, and so at any point at 1, 2, 3 or 4, you might want to go back 1 or 2 steps to ensure that the analytics is going to meet the needs and answer the question that you have. So that's the analytics process. Oh, I've lost my mouse. There we go. And then the third and final stage of the whole of the processing is product and services. So this is the creation of the results, but packaged into a usable format to match the original requirements. And how this is presented will depend very much on the end user and the intended application and what decisions will be taken as a result. So it's really important for all partners to work together to establish the requirements and ensure that the products will support the intended use. And mobile network operators have numerous tools at their disposal for refining, analysing, visualising data, and would be able to help to select and develop the most appropriate output. But you really need to think about who it is that's going to be using this data and ensure that it fits for them. So examples of reports might be just a one-off report, something that produces one set of data and that's that. It could be a regular report, maybe a regular monthly update. It could be a visualization like the example we've got here, or the dashboards that we saw yesterday. I think also the other thing to bear in mind, if there is already a decision-making process that exists, let's say that we are producing something for a local government department, they've already got a decision-making process, then it makes sense as well to evaluate delivering something that can be incorporated into the existing process as well, to make it smoother and easier for that data to be received and understood and acted upon. So in terms of a little bit more detail on creating the right output, we have a number of things that we can consider if we're looking at this graph diagram. So the first, let me use my pointer, is visual, which we have up here, compared to quantitative. So is the output needed to give an overview of phenomena? Will it be necessary to really drill down into the details? So visual or quantitative could be an either or option. And then the next is it something that is just a one-off here we go, just like a one-off piece of work, or is it something that needs to be updated? Is it basically tracking progress over time, and that kind of thing? So if it's a single historical study, or if it's something that will progress, we need to consider if it's a one-off or if it's updated. And then finally, apologies, got too many screens open. We want to look at the difference between static and interactive. So does the end user need to be able to interact with it and adjust the output, or perform any functional queries, or reframe the display? Is it a map, for example, that they might want to zoom in and out of? Or are there requirements for one or more sophisticated functionality that the decision maker might want to take on that? Is there a combination of different reviews that are required? And actually the real critical question is, what decisions will be made with the data insights? And if we have that at the front of mind all of the time, what decisions are going to be made, then that will really help us understand how these insights should be best delivered to the decision maker. So this diagram basically just shows us some of the options that we've got there. So the next thing we're going to move on to, now we've talked about, we've got this raw data, we have processed it so it's usable, we have worked together potentially with third parties to understand what insights we need to create, and we've been through the analytics process and we've developed the insights, and then the insights have been displayed in a most suitable way. But we need to really talk about that's the what, but we need to really talk about the how. And so that for the next couple of slides, we're going to think about the stakeholders in the mobile data analytics ecosystem and the roles that these play in towards, making a positive impact and delivering a positive project. So there'll be a special focus on the role of the government, policymakers and regulators to help you build your understanding of actions that can be taken to get involved in projects using mobile big data and AI. So let's move to this next slide. Okay. So this diagram, it depicts a mobile operator supported project in production, and it illustrates the split between the supply side and the demand side participants and the flow of data. So hopefully you can see all of that okay. It shows how, at a really high level, this can be delivered by participants involved in mobile data analytics and AI in a single country. So many different stakeholders play different roles in identifying the needs, converting mobile big data into actionable insights, and realising the impact from the insights. So there's a large number of stakeholder groups and a plethora of organisations and individuals that make up this group. And it can really create quite a complex environment for implementing solutions. So identifying and engaging the relevant stakeholders in each setting is essential to forge a very effective partnership. And elements for interdependence occur between the stakeholders as the concerns of one can be overcome through working, with another. So working together can really help to forge a common way forward. So for example, public sector stakeholders could make small changes to their regulatory frameworks to allow for the use of aggregated mobile data indicators while still protecting the personal information of individual mobile users. And let me just dive in to see if there's anything particularly more on this slide that I want to. I guess probably what I haven't said actually is very broadly on the demand side, we mean those organisations that have challenges that they're trying to address or questions that they'd like answered using the insight. So on this side, there could be the governments and development agencies, and potentially there may be donors involved if they are either funding projects or perhaps have third-party data that they may want to be able to provide. Then in the central section, we've got the supply side, which is the network operators and any potential other third party, or the network operators working on the processing, the analytics part, and then the packaging part, or the products and services part that we've talked about already. And then back to the demand side, who obviously are receiving the end insights. And if we look at the bottom here, we talk about how the regulatory environment can support ensuring that the right inputs go in, and then we also potentially have facilitators on the insight side, such as development agents and donors who may, for example, be implementing solutions. So, for example, if it was using mobile data to understand where there's been climate-related migration and new water washing facilities, drinking water facilities need to be deployed, then potentially a development agency or a donor might use those insights in order to deploy the facilities to the appropriate location. Okay, lost my mouse again. Here we are. Great. So a little bit more then around the demand side agencies. Well, why are they important? Well, the demand side agencies are the institutions and organisations that use the insights from the analysis of the mobile big data. So these are often governments. They're the primary customer on the demand side, and it's important that mobile operators have a direct relationship with the departments or the department in the government, because they are the end customers who will make the practical use of the analytics and insights. And it's vital for the operator and the government to clearly define the problem, that both parties understand how the mobile data analytics can contribute. So if you remember back to when we were talking about the processing, part of the processing of the data is around looking at things like the temporal and the spatial categorization of the data, and understanding what is required to be done at that processing part. Understanding what the requirements are can influence how that data is processed. So the demand side agencies also, as well as the government, can include development agencies, NGOs, research institutions, or other social impact organisations. And the demand side agencies, these are the organisations that have the specialised knowledge of the challenges that they're trying to address. So they understand what the problem is that they're trying to solve. The demand side agency plays a really important role in articulating the problem statement, and that should enable the identification of the relevant indicators and the solutions that we need to put in place to address it. It's also worth mentioning as well that it's probably obvious as well, but the demand side agency could also potentially be a provider of third-party data. So as we saw in the India case yesterday, the Department of Health provided the TB data. So as the problem, as the demand side trying to answer the question, they may also have highly relevant data that could contribute to the analytics. Okay, in terms of supply side agencies, so the most common supply side participant is the mobile network operator, of course, who's providing the mobile data, but also third-party data providers that are highly valuable. Mobile operators can play multiple roles, as we've already seen. So, as we know, collectively they handle about 10 billion calls daily, and so they can collect, store and process the resulting data in a way that protects the privacy of individuals and groups, and it can create these key indicators such as location and mobility, usage, demographic data, etc., as we've already talked about. And as we've also said as well, the MNO has the operator has a distinct understanding of the mobile data, and it puts them in that unique position to be able to process and analyse it. It's able to contextualise the data where it's relevant as well. And but also third-party data providers are organisations from different industries with complementary data sets, and these can be combined with mobile big data to provide context and enhance insights. So these include, and I think we've touched on these earlier actually, is satellite and drone companies for geospatial data, Earth observing institutions, actually we didn't mention those earlier, social networks and sharing economy firms, open data platforms, national statistic agencies, meteorology agencies, public sector agencies including health, agriculture, utilities, education, etc., 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 lots. And actually also retail industry potentially could be, depending on the question, of course, could be a provider of third-party data. So, you know, when you're thinking about one of these kind of projects, you know, any potential data could be, any potential data that you think of for a particular challenge, you know, could be a relevant third-party piece of data. Okay. So in terms of the government, again, we've kind of touched on this already, but the government plays a number of roles in one of these mobile big data analytic projects. First of all, they're the beneficiary. They're also often the demand side agency. It's not always the case that they are the requesting party, but they're often the beneficiary, even if they're not requesting the data, the insight, sorry. There could be a third-party data provider, as we've talked about with health or agriculture data, for example, but also as a regulator, overseeing the elements of privacy, for example, and we're going to touch on that in the latter half of this session today, and also a policymaker, of course. So let's actually move on to this. Let's move on to the next. Yeah, okay, great. We'll go to the quiz because I think actually that was a really good point for us to move on to the final section, which talks about policy, regulation and AI ethics as well. So let's go to question. Quick quiz. So again, we'll do A, B, C, D and E for the first one. So there's multiple answers actually for this first question. Third-party data providers are not MNOs that can provide the following types of data. So what data would we get from a non-MNO? So the first one is weather, call data, social network connections, mobile phone location, and statistics from national bodies. So I can see that, yeah, B is correct. Oh, hang on, sorry. Let me rephrase the question. Let me reread the question. Third-party data that are not MNOs can be provided by the following, can provide the following types of data. So let me rephrase it. What out of this list comes from organisations that are not mobile operators? So a few people have said B, which is call data. I think maybe the question was confusing. Call data obviously comes from the mobile network operators. So we've got from FETA A, D and E. So A, yeah, weather doesn't come from the operators. That's correct. That's from a third party. Also, we had D, mobile phone location does come from the operator. We've got a few different answers. E, statistics from national bodies. That's correct. Let me go through all these because I think there's some mixed answers. So let's take them in turn. So first of all, weather data, that comes from a third party. So the next is call data. Call data comes from the mobile network operator. Next, now social network connection. So this can be a bit of a tricky one actually. So mobile networks can provide data that is called social network connections, but actually what it refers to is the interaction between regions. So for example, if a lot of telephone calls, for example, are made between region A and region C, we can look to see where regions are well connected. So that's called social network connection data in the world of mobile big data analytics. However, I think like a lot of people, we often think about social networks as in the applications like Facebook and Instagram and all of those. So the answer is kind of, the answer is both, isn't it? So social networks in relation to Facebook, for example, the mobile network operator has no access to any of that data. So that isn't available. However, what we can do is show connections between groups of people across different regions. So good opportunity to talk about that. And the next one was mobile phone location. Did I see somebody say that you were inclined to say C as well? It's moving quite quickly. So I think somebody did. A few people have picked up on C. Mobile phone location. The mobile network operator can provide that, but obviously it's aggregated, so we can see groups of it rather than individuals. And then finally, statistics from national bodies. Obviously, not from the operator. They are indeed from third party. Oh, it's a bit complicated to do that, wasn't it, over the chat, but hopefully everybody's with that one. So now the next one then, what should governments do in the mobile data context? And there's multiple answers to this one as well. So I tell you what, let's go through, let's go through each one at a point and say yes or no, should we? So define policy that creates an enabling environment. Is that something that government should do? Define policy that creates an enabling environment. Yeah, great. Thanks, Mohammed. Yeah, Elisa. Yeah, lovely. Thank you. Yeah, they should do that. Should they use insights to plan expenditure? I think they can, absolutely. So I think that governments can potentially use mobile insights to help them work out perhaps where they deploy expenditure resources to respond to a pandemic, for example, where to put the resources first. The next one is use the data as a way to track individual citizens. Individual citizens, use the data as a way to track individual citizens. I think this is a trick question, isn't it? So we can absolutely use the data to track groups of people, but we don't want to be tracking individuals. So if we remember back, and we'll be talking about this in a little while, in order to protect the privacy of our individual citizens, we don't track them individually. We aggregate the data so we can understand patterns of movement, not patterns of individual people. And then the final is, should governments enforce relevant laws and regulations? Yeah, absolutely. And actually, Jenny, so I've just seen your comment about going back to use the data as a way to track individual citizens. Yeah, I guess that might be certainly done in some countries, certainly from, I've jumped ahead, haven't I? Certainly from a GSMA perspective and from many countries' perspectives, there's the focus on privacy. And if you remember a few slides ago, we talked about how through surveys that have been done, the element of trust is really important for mobile network operator because it's very important to their customers. So the operators themselves are find it very, very important for us to protect the individual privacy. So are very driven towards anonymization and aggregation so that we can see patterns of movement, but not patterns for individuals. So yeah, great point, Matt. Okay, so I think we've got a couple more. Sorry, I thought I'd gone through another quiz. Right, okay, so that was that one. My slides are a little small in front of me. Okay, so before we move on to the final chapter, for today. There's also, we just need to cover sustainable business models. This actually used to be in the final chapter, which is what's thrown me. So far we've discussed what big data is, and we've got an understanding of how we use it. We understand a little bit more about how it's processed, and then all of the various stakeholders that we need to make up a successful project. But for mobile big data and AI to fulfill the potential described in the use cases, there needs to be a sufficient incentive for the products and services to be developed. And in this final section of part 3, we want to examine sustainable business models and understanding the role that they play in providing that incentive. Mobile big data products and services have proven their proficiency and as a decision support tool, and we've seen all of those examples through the last day or two. But developing sustainable products and services which can be replicated and enhanced over time requires ongoing investment. And I think yesterday it was mentioned about it was recognised about the amount of effort, and hopefully we've seen today about the amount of effort that it takes to turn that raw data into something usable. So data and analytics and AI is a really fast growing field, and in order to offer the best solutions, the mobile operators need to find ways to invest in that innovation, and all of this drives the need for business models that are sustainable in the long term rather than just short term, like one-off funding. And without a sustainable business model, we don't think that we'll be able to, we won't be able to achieve the potential that mobile big data can realise. So if we look a little bit at the next slide, it talks about what we mean by a sustainable business model. So just to recap, I'm going to be very brief on this because we are pushing on for time, but we've talked about the 3 stages: the processing, the analytics, and the products and service development. And all of these processes take time within the organisation. They take expertise from the staff of the operators, but also, if you remember, we talked right at the beginning about the size of the data. It also requires certain software and storage solutions in order to store and manage these vast amounts of data. So when we talk about sustainable business models, what we're talking about is a way to fund all of that activity in order to produce this output. Of course, we can always do one-off projects, and these are the kind of projects that are delivered without a sustainable business model. So these kind of projects tend to only last for a couple of months. They lack the time and resources to make any meaningful change. They often require just a one-off investment, but as a result, they only provide a one-off output. So in this whole scheme of things, they only provide really a limited impact. And I think we strongly believe that, in contrast to that, projects that are underpinned by a sustainable business model can attract a much longer term investment. They can create incentives to innovate further, looking for that additional data, looking for the new insights that can be identified, new dashboards and products that can be developed. It encourages the exploration of new use cases. It can achieve scale, delivering benefits to more people, maybe across a whole country or across further geographies. It can enable investment into new techniques, such as new AI techniques, new products for customers to use, or more accurate models, and potentially it can deliver that larger impact. And also, fundamentally, it could transform understanding and a way of working if we can reliably rely on this accurate, regularly updated insight that's being created. So the benefits of business models that are sustainable, the long-term planning helps to ensure that there is enough certainty about ongoing budget for expertise, tools, infrastructure and processes. They all need to be funded within the organisation. Funding is a chief element that needs to be considered in terms of amount, source and length of time that's available. Securing long-term funding then makes it possible to invest in innovation, as I've already said. Business models that are beneficial for both the demand and supply side are also recommended, because this means that all of the organisations that need to be involved have an incentive to participate, which is critical when we're looking at these kinds of multi-agency solutions. So where the customer can achieve tangible results and impact, then there's a real incentive to assign a budget to be able to go on to develop these projects. And when a supplier receives a commitment to fund their expert teams of people and analytics tools, then they can then go on to invest in enhancing and extending these. So it's a positive loop going forward. So finally, a self-sustaining business model enables a positive feedback loop for the demand and supply side. So sustained activity generates more output and greater social impact, and this in turn drives more interest in expanding the use cases. So being able to share some of the examples that we did yesterday hopefully will encourage the trial in new areas, and then we can turn this into a real opportunity for large scale positive impact. Okay, so very briefly on the types of business models, we've got 5 types here. So philanthropic, which is where a lot of them start. So this is an ad hoc or continuous projects with pro bono data provided at no charge. Donor subsidised, cross subsidies, where revenues from other big data projects. So there are a couple of operators in the world who provide these type of solutions as a commercial service, and the revenues and the profits from that can help to fund the social good projects. Tiered, where these services might be offered at a basic level for free with some additional elements paid for. And then finally, fully sustainable, where something has a standalone business model and it's not dependent upon any other projects or products. And this is the kind of sustainable solution that can generate a long-term income, so it can be self-sustaining. And in terms of how the models develop over time, often we see projects starting as a pilot, so maybe with a philanthropy business model where some data is donated and third-party data is donated to test the kind of insights that it could drive. Then a small implementation, and maybe there may be a donor model or some sort of cross-subsidy model to provide the funding to implement, and then maturing into a scaled product, which could be a tiered product or a fully sustainable business model, which is obviously the objective. I have got a little quiz on this, but if I'm going to quickly go through this and jump to the last section, because I'm a little bit conscious of the time. But this last question says, what is the likely outcome of a project without a sustainable business model? And the answer is that it lacks the time and resources to make a meaningful change. So without sustainable business model, we can't offer that meaningful long-term solution. Okay, right. So that was quite a long session. I hope you were all still with me. And if you sat at your desk, feel free to sort of stand up and shake your arms about before we go into this final session. We've got around 40 minutes left. And for this last session, we're going to look at the principles of mobile big data and AI. And as I mentioned earlier, we've got two key areas. The first is policy and regulatory considerations, and then the second is the ethical AI. Now, as we go into this, there are a number of links, and Andreas did mention that we will share the slides afterwards. As we get into them, I'll point out the links for some further additional reading, particularly around the AI, which is, of course, been of interest to a lot of people. Okay, so as big data and AI continue to evolve, there are a number of policy and regulatory considerations that are important for policymakers and regulators, and in this final session we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail. So first of all, it's important to understand the general framework regulating the use of telecommunications data. And I'm guessing with the audience that I'm talking to, you are going to be quite familiar with this, but for completeness, over 120 countries in the world now have data protection laws in place, and these laws are generally data protection laws that cover the use of personal data, regardless of technology and sector. However, in addition to the general data protection and privacy laws, mobile and fixed operators are also subject to this additional list here. So licence conditions, multimedia communication laws, e-privacy, interception and disclosure, data retention, electronic transaction laws, statutory code of conduct and guidelines. So when we're developing a big mobile data project, mobile network operators have to consider whether the use of mobile data complies with requirements under all of these different laws, regulations and licence conditions, which makes for a complex legal landscape and can potentially create challenges for mobile network operators. So to identify the elements of a strong and streamlined future-proof privacy framework, in 2019, the GSMA issued a Smart Privacies Law publication, which built on mobile privacy principles that were first released in 2011. And this resource identifies some common elements and principles included in sort of smart data privacy laws around the world. And at a high level, for a data privacy law to be successful, it must provide effective protection for individuals, but at the same time, it should provide organisations with that freedom to operate, innovate and comply in a way that makes sense for their business and can secure, positive outcomes for society. So these two objectives drive the rest of the principles outlined here. So the law should be guided by a principle that puts the responsibility onto organisations to identify and mitigate privacy risks while remaining flexible, technology and sector neutral, and allowing data to move across borders easily. So let's look at the main elements of the smart data privacy law here. So the first one is accountability, and I've got my point here, which is down here, and as it's indicating, this is the bedrock on which all other elements can be built. So organisations should be liable for what they do with personal data, but accountability does not just mean liable in law, it also goes beyond compliance, and the law should explicitly provide that organisations should be able to demonstrate to individuals and supervisory authorities that they've put in place comprehensive and effective measures. So the law should award accountable organisations by allowing responsible data governance and practice to be taken into account when setting administrative formalities. Get my words out. So this has the effect of incentivising responsible data governance and provides a more comprehensive and genuine way to address privacy concerns. So very much we're built on giving the organisation accountability, which brings with it transparency, etc. So if we look at that at the bedrock, we can move on to the next layer, some of the components that we recommend for an approach. So the next layer looks at principles So data protection laws should not be too prescriptive. Instead, they should operate on the basis of principles so as to ensure flexibility and to accommodate changes in business practice and technology. So, for example, mandating or specifying that data should only be kept for 3 months might have unintended negative consequences. And instead, we recommend that organisations encouraged to consider how long they really need the data for, based on the data that they're collecting and the purpose that it's serving. So, for example, if we think back to the case where we're looking at long-term migration patterns as a result of climate disaster, if we can only keep the data for 3 months, we want to potentially see what people have been doing over, a 6, 12, 18-month period. The next is around horizontal. So general data privacy laws usually apply to any processing of personal data, regardless of the sector or technology. This is positive for consumers, as it gives them a consistent protection without having to worry about what technology they're using or whether the activity they are engaged in is any specific rules or not. And it's positive also for the whole digital ecosystem, because traditional segments of the internet value chain are dynamic and creating new models all of the time. So it facilitates competition and sets out a constant standard if we have horizontal rules. It's also positive for the mobile industry, as the industry has to comply with legacy sectoral rules and license conditions, while over-the-top services such as messaging apps, for example, don't. So that makes for an uneven playground. So when horizontal general data privacy laws are considered for the first time, or if they're overhauled after existing for some time, it provides a useful opportunity for governments to review those legacy sectoral rules and implement and enforce a horizontal rule instead of sectoral, so that can simplify the relevant legal framework for mobile big data analytics projects, and also still provide the comfort for the end user as well. And then the final one on this section is around focusing on harms. So general data privacy law should focus on the risk of harms to individuals. So obligation or duties that don't focus on risk of harm to individuals result in kind of a blanket or a checkbox approach that brings little value to individuals and undermines the credibility of the law. So individuals should have information about what information is held about them, what data is collected and processed and stored, and they should be able to make meaningful choices about how their data is used. So that's our focus there. If we move on to the next slide, the next layer. So the next set of principles provide further guidance to those involved in mobile analytics about how to plan projects. So the first is around flexible grounds for processing. So general data privacy laws should provide organisations with a range of grounds on which they can process personal data. So while consent can be appropriate in many instances, an over-reliance on consent can lead to consent fatigue, rendering poor outcomes for individuals. So additional grounds such as legitimate interests of the controller, compliance with legal obligations, vital interests, etc., could provide the right mix of flexibility for organisations, and also critically protection for individuals. And then ex post, this is we're in a really fast-paced digital world, and it's impossible to scrutinise data processing activities in advance. So it makes more sense to allow the organisations to demonstrate compliance, and this comes back to our accountability layer here. However, that said, it shouldn't prevent the data protection authorities from requesting information from organisations, or from investigating them, or from imposing sanctions, and transparency, of course, is a key element to that. And then finally, the top layer, I'm going to mention briefly privacy by design. So general privacy data law should include privacy by design and a privacy impact assessment. And I think we do have a privacy impact link available later on. And then also promoting data flow. So general data privacy laws should have an enabling approach in order to allow personal data flows across borders. The reason for that is we've often found, as we've been deploying these kind of projects, that sometimes we have organisations where the expertise might sit in a regional head office or a head office, and if data is unable to move outside of the country, then that leaves a problem with available skill to undertake the project. So promoting data flows is certainly supported in these kind of projects. So if I move to the next one, and apologies, I hope I'm not going too fast, but I'm keen to cover some of the key points here. So and one of the key points is around privacy and talking about making ensuring the data is private. So the analytics of mobile data, as we know, can be used by governments to, but also the use of this data can potentially invoke a strong reaction. And we've kind of picked up on this a little bit over the last 2 days, but there is a risk that people may fear being tracked by using this data. And as we've been at pains to say, mobile big data analytics is very much not about tracking individuals. So great care, as I've already said, is taken by mobile operators to ensure that privacy of their mobile phone users is protected, and it's important to maintain that trust. And we know that there are general data protection laws, there are telecommunication privacy requirements, etc., already in place. But even without privacy laws or other obligations, there are a number of important considerations for mobile operators who are planning these kind of projects. So the 6 items, well 7 actually, is first of all is making the mobile data non-identifiable, as we've talked about. Implementing privacy by design, by which we mean right at the outset of the project to ensure that steps are taken to protect the privacy of the individual, starting with the anonymisation and aggregation of the data. Maintaining accountability at all points through the process. Transparency is a key element, so it's clear how the data is being used. And then the bottom 3 are around locking down access to data. So when that data is being processed and being managed, ensuring that only the correct people have got access to the data. By correct, I mean only the approved people have got access to the data, and access to that data is recorded when people log into it, when people log out of it. Appropriate handling of cross-border data transfers, and also considering the ethical issues, which we're going to talk about in a few moments. So going back to making the data non-identifiable, we have 3 steps. First of all, that's removing the data fields that enable identification, as we've talked about, but that potentially could be still pseudonymized data. Aggregating the data to remove the possibility or significantly reduce the possibility of being able to re-identify any individuals in that group, and check the merging of multiple sets of data does not result in people being re-identified again. So again, if even, once the data's been aggregated and anonymised, just ensure that any additional data doesn't undo any of that. So that's the non-identifiable. And then privacy by design. So this is an example of good practice, and it requires organisations to identify and mitigate the risks through the through the life cycle, of the product development, as I mentioned a couple of slides ago. So one of the key tools to ensure privacy is in place for individuals is through a privacy impact assessment, and this is a mechanism that's used by organisations to evaluate the impact of an individual risk to high risk processing activities. And so once you've gone through this impact assessment, it allows you to take action and respond to any potential risks that there may be in the processing. Locking down access to the mobile data, I've already kind of touched on. We need to ensure that only authorised users have got access to the data, particularly in its raw form or in its non-anonymised and aggregated format. Securing it, so ensuring that the cybersecurity systems are as good as can be. Set appropriate time limits for data retention. So we don't want to keep the data forever, but we don't want to delete it too soon. So ensuring that it's relevant to the practice, and finally using anonymisation and aggregation, of course. Right, sorry, there's a question from Krishna. Are we talking about mobile data at rest or real-time data or both? I think we're talking about both, actually. I think we're talking about any data that we hold any data at all, actually. Any data needs to be evaluated to identify any risk of privacy invasion. One example I can give you is I was working on a project at one point that looked at monitoring the environment in an agricultural fields, and it involved deploying sensors into the ground to do things like measure the moisture and the air temperature and things like that. And as part of the privacy assessment, one of the evaluations had to ensure that the sensor didn't contain any data that registered the name of the farmer that owned the land that was on which we were testing. So that could be kind of fairly static data, as well as the fast-moving CDR data as well. So it could be a third-party data that potentially might have personal data that would need to be checked for. So that checking under every stone is the best advice on that. So hopefully that answers the question, Krishna. Okay. So the final, lovely, thank you. So the final, this is my final slide actually on this section, and then we'll move on to the ethical AI, which is the closing section before wrap up. So hopefully the whole theme for this area is around, our recommendations are around maintaining accountability and clear roles and clear documentation. For example, the organisation may want to keep a log of API event access or ask third parties to report on their use of the data and insights, and actually, this is the important part, where there are several organisations collaborating or pooling the data. It's recommended that the project really set out the ground rules for the access of the data and establishing answers to a number of questions. So when you're thinking about the data, think about this. What data is going to be made available to whom and in what form? Will the data be pseudonymised before it is aggregated? Will there be access to any raw data? And if so, who's got it? Who is allowed to access it? who has access to the findings, who can determine the design and purpose of the algorithm. Because actually, going back to the findings, of course, might be anonymised and aggregated, but potentially they still could be sensitive. So there may be no personal data in it, but it still could be a sensitive findings. Who can determine the design and purpose of the algorithms, and to whom will the insights from the analytics be disseminated to, and who is going to control the actions taken based on the insights. So regulators and policymakers can play a role in supporting the industry to implement their own processes and solutions to ensure clear accountability. So that is a role that the policymakers and regulators can make in this area. Okay, right. So we have 20 minutes left, and we are the last section that we have to cover is an introduction to ethical AI. And I think I mentioned at the beginning that there are a couple of links in here with some really valuable content. So when you receive the slides at the end, this area is of interest, because I think we could have 2 sessions just on this topic, then you'll find some additional supporting information. So yeah, let me move to the next slide. Actually, no, let me stay here for a second. So it says here, AI has the potential to truly change the world. And this represents not only an opportunity, but also brings with it significant responsibility. And I think we've all heard, haven't we, some of the concerns and risks around AI. So as we know, AI depends upon large amounts of data, and it often relates to individuals, and it makes inferences based on this data. And these inferences may be used to guide decisions that have a significant impact on the things that people care about the most. So, for example, their health, their employment, and their access to resources. I'm sure most people have heard that these days in recruitment, AI is often used to deal with the first pass of applications for new roles, for example. So it's therefore really vital that AI is used in a responsible and ethical way that is human-centric and human rights orientated. Okay, so in terms of ethical AI, there's a really broad scope here, and it encompasses topics including fairness and transparency and accountability. And as a result, it covers many ways in which an organisation can operate. So with this slide, we're providing a kind of high-level overview into a potential implementation journey that an organisation might go through when they're implementing AI. So it's useful to think of the implementation of ethical AI as a journey that can be taken by the organisation. And each organisation will have their own AI strategy, which will determine how large or small a role that AI plays within the business. And the extent to which AI is leveraged within an organisation will be reflected in the structures and the processes that are required. So if an organisation decides that they're not ready to make extensive use of AI, then they will implement ethical governance instructions in proportion to that scale of deployment. So, for instance, an organisation would only set up a full ethics committee if their adoption of AI is extensive and relatively mature. So let's look at the steps on the journey and the considerations that need to be made at each step. So before starting out, right at the beginning, up here, you can see the little triangle warning there. It's helpful to have external advisors available to consent. So experts with practical experience of making this same journey can provide guidance on best practices, particularly as we're so early in the uptake of AI solutions in organisations. The first step on the organisation's journey would be to put in place some guiding frameworks, and this includes establishing in some instances, leveraging an existing data governance model and defining AI ethical principles and guidelines. So that's the first step, kind of to understand our guiding framework of what the organisation is going to aim for with regards to ethical AI. The second step is around leadership. And a well-informed leadership is really critical. Executives need to understand AI ethics, and they need to drive change from the top to ensure that it's successfully adopted. And to do this, an executive committee or an advisory panel is often put in place to oversee policies and practical practices that deliver ethical AI. And then the third step is around processes and policies. A governance structure is required alongside a risk management system in order to ensure that it can be identified and then resolved or escalated. So implementing ethical AI often requires changes to existing policy and business processes and a change to management activity, and is therefore needed to accompany the deployment of ethical AI. So I think as we go through these, we'll see that AI isn't something that we can just bolt onto an organisation. It has to be considered throughout the whole organisation structure. So as we go to the next stage, people, this is about considering the everybody in the organisation. So many companies will introduce a basic AI ethics training and awareness raising by across the whole organisation. So if you're becoming an organisation that is starting to deploy AI, then if it's at scale, then it makes sense for your whole people base to have some basic AI training. But beyond that, it's important that there are specific roles within the organisation that are empowered to act ethically around AI. And this may mean that they have extensive additional AI ethics training. Typically, I think these are referred to as the responsible AI champions in some organisations, and often AI product managers. And these people are responsible for the design and the development of the AI products and services, and also championing responsible AI. And then finally, the fifth step on the journey relates to ongoing activity, which embeds AI ethics within the organisation. So it involves monitoring and learning in order for AI ethics to be scaled with confidence within an organisation. And to do this, AI risks need to be captured and actions need to be taken to mitigate them. So concrete examples of products and services should also be studied so that the organisation as a whole can learn from what's been implemented either inside the organisation or outside of the organisation. So many organisations have started on this journey. A few may have the AI maturity and scale of deployment to have implemented several of the operational governance changes as described, but others are still kind of progressing through this. So in summary, this is a kind of a roadmap, and it's kind of in its early phases, and this is kind of current guidance on how an organisation may go around dealing with ethical AI. I think the summary is it's quite a new area still. So what we wanted to cover here, though, is some examples of what ethical behaviour looks like. So as AI has developed and the potential risks of AI have become clearer, many organisations have written AI ethical principles for this purpose. And defining a set of principles is important because principles underpin action, and they guide the way in which the organisation operates. So there are also a few powerful means of communicating to employees within the organisation or to the world outside about how AI is being addressed ethically. Therefore, ethical AI principles not only steer internal action, but they also demonstrate commitment to action to external customers, suppliers and governments, which of course is critical, particularly if we kind of link back to this concept of trust as well, trust and transparency. So I'm going to jump to the next stage. So this slide here covers some commonly adopted ethical AI principles, so not specific to the telco industry, but broadly across all organisations that are engaged in ethical AI principles. So in terms of the items we've got listed, we've got fairness. So for an AI system to be fair, it mustn't discriminate against people or groups in a way that leads to adverse decisions or inferences. Non-discrimination and equality are central features of the major human rights treaties in many countries and laws, and fairness should reflect that in AI. Excuse me. The next is around human agency and oversight. So it's important to determine an appropriate level of human oversight and control of an AI system. So as AI directs decision making, people may become reliant on a system, and we don't want that to happen. Organizations must respect human autonomy. So that must be kept in sight at all times. The next is privacy and security, which is a common theme, of course, as we've talked about the last 2 days. So AI systems should respect and uphold an individual's right to privacy, just as with mobile big data, and ensure that personal data is protected and secure. And organisations using AI should pay special attention to any additional privacy and security risks that an AI system might bring forth. The next is around safety and robustness. So all AI systems should be safe, robust and reliably operated in accordance with their intended purpose throughout their life cycle. So the very nature of AI means it can evolve, and we need a clear view of what's happening with that. Transparency and explainability. So it's important to be transparent about when an AI system is used. So for example, if you are applying for a new role, you want to know if AI is being used to judge you in the first step, or if your medical results are being monitored for the first pass by an AI system also, for example. But we also, what a person might want to know is what kind of data is being used and what is its purpose. So explainability is the principle of communicating the reasoning behind a decision in a way that is understandable to a range of people. And it's not always clear how AI systems have arrived at that conclusion. So we need to be able to explain how decisions are made. The next is accountability, which of course links back to our principles from earlier. So organisations should have a governance structure that makes it clear who is responsible for reporting and decision making, and thereby ultimately accountable throughout the life cycle. So not just at the beginning product design stage, but throughout the whole life cycle of the service. And accountability is key to complying with regulatory and legal requirements, of course, as we just talked about a few slides ago. And then the final on this slide is around environmental well-being. So all AI systems must be designed, developed and deployed in a way that is mindful of environmental impact throughout the life cycle, and with careful consideration of systematic consequences. AI can help to secure a sustainable future. So there's a real positive impact in there, but it needs to be built into the principles. Okay, so we've got around 8 minutes left. So the next slide I'm going to go very briefly on, but then I'm coming to a bunch of links which might be helpful. So this slide here just proposes a governance model for within an organisation for how to manage ethical AI management. So at the bottom here, we've got the level 1, which is the responsible AI team. So this is the business as usual team who are working day to day on products and services. And these can deal with any AI ethics cases that might require at a daily level. They've got access to assessment tools. They can discuss based on their experience. It's got various tools. So this tends to be the AI product managers and the responsible AI champion that we mentioned earlier. And it involves self-assessment questionnaires and accompanying tools, which I'm going to show in a moment. Next is an ethics committee. So this ethics committee deals with more complex or higher risk cases that come up in an ethical AI review. It will have a range of diverse experts on here. So maybe it might have the legal team, might have HR people involved. It might have PR included. So I don't mean PR, well, maybe PR, but I think I mean corporate social responsibility organisations, data protection experts, that kind of thing. And then the executive board, who receive a very small number of cases, but these are the last point of escalation for any serious risk to the organisation or to the individual. And this tends to be the C-suite leadership, and they may take go or no-go decisions about any particular use case that might be deployed, or if a project needs to be pulled, for example. So that's an example there. And then if you move to the tools, which I think are valuable, then we can see these links here. So at the GSMA, and the AI ethics playbook has been written, and this has been written by a group of mobile network operators, and its purpose is to provide a broader set of guidelines for implementing ethical AI. It includes a self-assessment questionnaire, which we mentioned at that kind of working level, to allow the organisation to do some checks on the ethical nature of any project that you might want to undertake. So I won't spend much time talking on this because we're very short of time, but that will be available to everybody. Sorry, that will be available to everybody on the slides afterwards. Okay, so I think we are nearly towards the summary slide. However, I just want to mention on here that AI policies and regulations are still evolving. So in terms of compliance, this is a model that's taken from the European Union, where we can identify where the levels of risk, and the level of risk might be adaptable by organisation. Of course, non-acceptable risk is unacceptable to all organisations. Okay, so finally, on recommendations for implementing ethical AI. So first of all, we need to prioritise the data quality. So all systems are only as good as their data, and fundamentally, a fundamental requirement of ethical AI is high quality data and well managed data. So this goes back, of course, to the mobile big data that we talked about. If we're using that processing is critical. Assigning clear roles and responsibilities to ensure good governance, adopting a life cycle approach, so not just designing it, launching it and leaving it, practicing the inclusivity of design and diversity, so ensuring that diversity is included in the design of the project, anticipating future context of the application. So this covers both the ways in which an AI system may change its outputs, but also how the context in which it's deployed might change as well. This is particularly important if you've got a high-risk AI project. Defining policies, controls and compliance. So organisations need clear mechanisms and controls in place in order to comply with data and AI ethics guidelines and regulations. It's vital also that they follow evolving national and global regulations and requirements to understand what is required of them. And finally, investing in training and awareness. So it's important that both your staff and your customers are aware of the AI ethics, that there's AI literacy, and it should be built throughout the organisation, ensuring that the entire workforce understands what it is. And it's also relevant for regulators, policymakers and their departments, as well as for the industry. Jenny, I can see that there's a question. I can see that we're short of time, so if that's okay, I'll come back to this and provide a written answer via Andrea, if that's okay. Okay, so I'm going to skip the quiz. Oops, beg your pardon. Right, hang on. There we go. And to the course summary. Those last couple of slides that I've just bumped through are, if we were in person, we'd have a little activity to work a little bit more on the AI. So apologies, we can't do that remotely. So right on time with 1 minute to go. We can jump to the course summary. So first of all, I want to say thank you for taking the course, and you've made it through to the final thoughts, and hopefully it's given you plenty to consider. But here are the key points that you might want to keep in mind for the future of this. So first of all, mobile data analytics and AI offers real benefits to society. Analytical products can provide governments with new decision support tools and insights, and can drive impact and societal benefits. The market for these products, though, is still developing, and it would benefit from an enabling regulatory environment. So if you remember, protecting the privacy of the individual but allowing for innovation. From responding to infectious disease outbreaks and natural disasters to helping tackle air pollution, internal migration and finding missing people, the range of problems mobile big data can address is wide and of global significance. A robust yet smart data data privacy framework is vital to success, and leveraging existing privacy laws, policy and regulatory processes wherever possible works well. And where legislation exists, it should be applied consistently and in a technology neutral way to mobile big data analytics and AI. And then finally, the fourth point is trust in mobile data analytics and AI very much depends on a robust privacy process and strong ethical behaviour. And we need to ensure that accountability lies with the organisations undertaking the analysis to design in privacy measures. And it needs to follow ethical principles and mitigate the risk in the most effective way. So I think that is the summary from me. Sorry I've taken you right up to the hour, but I hope that you found this valuable. And Jenny, I'll answer your question offline. But Andrea, sorry, we've gone to 1 minute past. Shall I hand over to you? Okay. I don't think we have Andrea. Okay, what I'm going to say then while we are waiting for Andrea is to recap what she said at the beginning of this session and the last session. I think that there is a short quiz that will be sent to you for you to complete online. And once that's completed, you'll receive your certificates. Any other additional information that we don't have from Andrea, we will follow up on the email. So thank you so much for joining us, and I hope that you've enjoyed it, and see you for the next course. A question from Colson: at what time would the course material be made available, and when will the quiz be made available? I think it's going to be shortly after this course, so I think it's going to be today or tomorrow. Is there a close in the time frame? I don't know the answer to that, Carlton, but let me ask Andrea to include the information in the email when she shares it. But I think we'll if you've got some time pressures, I'm guessing that we'll be able to accommodate those. Do you have any guidelines for governments to start implementing AI? I think beyond where I'd recommend you to start is for the ethical AI guidelines. So in the slide deck that we're going to share, there will be some, there's the links that are pointed to. It's quite a bit of information there, so I recommend starting with that point. Oh, Krishna says the deadline is within 2 days. Thanks, Krishna. Carlston, if you have a challenge with that, I suggest dropping an email to Andrea and to see if we can work around that for you. Okay, thank you, everybody. Sorry if I've missed any questions. Let me go back, see if I can answer that question from Jenny, if you're still here, Jenny. Certain countries, when data security is considered as a non-subject matter and undermined by its government organs, will you give us examples of how GSMA able to percept the data governance or... I think a quick answer to that is one of our recommendations for all operators is that any mobile network data from the operator is anonymised and aggregated before it leaves the operator's firewall. So everything stays within the operator systems before it's shared. And that's what we'd absolutely strongly recommend before the data is anonymized, until the data is at least anonymized and aggregated. And then from there, once processed, then the data is protected from the risk of exposing individuals' privacy. A couple more messages. Okay, thank you from everybody. Great, lovely. Thank you for the nice feedback. Okay, goodbye to everybody. Please do feel free to drop off. Apologies we don't have Andrea here. I think we might have just run over a little bit, but you'll hear from Andrea on the email.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining today and during these 2 days. Yes, I'm here. And just to remind you that you have to answer a quiz to receive your course certificate. So you have to access the course dashboard, and there you will see the link to take the quiz.
Great stuff. Thanks for that, Andrea. I don't know whether you heard the question, saw the question from Carlston, who has asked about the deadline for the quiz. He is now on leave for a little while. I think he was hoping for an extension. So I've asked him to drop you an email.
Yes, it's 2 days for all the participants. But yes, Carlston, if you have any questions, you can just write me an email.
Wonderful. Great. Okay. Thanks all again. Thanks for joining us. And good luck with the quiz.
Yes, thank you very much for joining. We hope you have enjoyed the course, and thank you, Joe, for delivering this course. So we hope to see you in a new opportunity. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
انتهينا خلاص. كيف يا بني؟ أنا فيها مسكين بس. أنا قاعد. الحمد لله.
Trên bàn mà dạ em là chỉ là dành tới là mình sử dụng cái này luôn mà chị ngoài anh sẽ không được dùng bài cứ đi mà ở đây là no mangiavo la biscuita. Andiamo a guardare. Andiamo a guardare. Questa era la
نسوان شرسين بطاقة
لو ما كان انت عملت اتم زين ده وريني ما هي بس انك انا قد نتين نسمشن يتين ليش انا والله نتين اتنشن يا جماعه تلاقي شو كده
قاعد اشوفك كده
لا لا ما قالوا كويس تبقي أربع سلايد الأول أساسا في 5 8 سلايد الأول كويشن ده زين من 100
مسلمين بقى بيغنوا يا زول مسلمين بقى بيغنوا موسيقى الله أقول كمان والله أنا أبدأ بجسرة نيجي نعمل ولا يلا نيجي بس celebrating
أيوة حضرتك خلاص لا أصلا ما داري شغل بنية أنا كويس ده يا أخو بس يا أنا لكن أنا ممكن أنا نقدر في البداية عشان نحاول نضيف الأمية ما قالوا في إكزام لا أنا المفروض قال بداية مسألة سهلة بداية قال له ولي كلام إكزام هيكون كده قال له إكزام ده يا كويس ده يا حاجة دي consider me طوالي أنا سألت I don't know how to back myself أنا قاعد بكرة هيكون في كمان Anche Mario, ti sei a quality service? Sì, ma c'è a quality. Non so, ma che è? Sapete suonare? Ma che pensa me Helena? EMC. No, ahorita sacarle los mensajes como son varios la no mo la que se llama a verla. Y te vas a ver también. Tranquila والله يا اخي انا شرح بطريقه كويس واحد غلط بس لكن إذا كان شايف السؤال أسئلتهم قاعدين يدل لنا ده من شرح أها في سؤال الإجابة بداخل السؤال ذاته زي كده ما بحتاج تمشي تاني ده السلايد إجابة إجاباتهم لا لا من وين؟ من دون سؤال لا دي لا وروح أسئلة قديمة من أسمعها تلقيها يا أخويا يقول لك أسئلة جاية من سلايد من 5 سلايد الأوائل يا أكثر من كده ثاني شنو ما حضرتك أصلا من ولا تقرأ تفتحوا بسلايد بقيت تشوفوا لي كويس إنك تشوفوا لي أنا ترى أي ما أنا بس تروح الفوز تزعيني ما عندها تعرف عنه هم قاعدين يتاخذوا من 10 اوكي اسئله 10 يلا 10 ده كان انت صح جاوبت كل يومين كان انت غلطت في واحد يا بنقص درجه واحد كده لسه قاعد ولا ولا مالك يكون انا لسه قاعد اشتغل ليه نفس دول اسمه اسمه تجاربي يا غاني ازونا زي بس انت وين في الجروب ما طريقة العزومة بالطبع إذا تعرف كان دارين تيجي ما دارين تيجي على كيفكم والله تسمع
This
training time in life. I'm about to come to the teacher. I still like this.